What is this moral perfectionism? Instead of focusing just on achievement, it would be focusing on your moral worth. So your identity is linked with how good you are as a person. And then the standards would again be unfeasibly high and inflexible. Maybe something like doing the most good you can, to coin a phrase.
Hypothetically.
Every moment of the day.
Yeah. Sounds tough.
Does sound very tough. So you'd worry about not doing it. You would procrastinate. Might even avoid some tasks because you avoid being in the public glare because you fear you might fail. And then if you didn't succeed, or you thought you hadn't succeeded in reaching that target, which of course you won't because it's such a tough target, sometimes you won't succeed in having a really fantastic outcome in everything you do, then you'll be very harsh self-criticism. And very often a result of that is shame. And shame is one of the least constructive emotions. Guilt can be quite a useful emotion, but shame is where you just feel like hiding away. So very often you just feel like escaping, so you don't get help. And you're just left with this feeling of very often self-hatred, self-loathing, because remember, your whole identity is wrapped up with being this really good person. You've set yourself a incredibly high, unfeasible standard to do that. You haven't achieved it, and then you're just left there on your own thinking that you failed and that you're a terrible person.
Hey listeners, Luisa here. You were just listening to therapist Tim LeBon from episode 149 on how altruistic perfectionism is self-defeating. Personally, I got a lot out of that episode. Tim was just so good at describing how a lot of his high-achieving patients end up beating themselves up for not maximizing the good they can do in a way that's actually totally counterproductive in terms of their long-term impact. Over the years, we've also heard from charity directors, researchers, psychiatrists, therapists, and career advisors, all wrestling with the kinds of mental health challenges that tend to come up when you're trying to do a lot of good and what can help. Today, we've got another compilation of some of the most insightful bits of wisdom from 16 past guests from the show. Coming up, you'll hear from 80,000 Hours former CEO on how he manages anxiety, self-doubt, and a chronic sense of falling short. Psychiatrist Randy Nesse on why we evolved to be anxious and depressed in the first place. Therapist Hannah Boettcher on how always optimizing can quietly distort our sense of self-worth. Charity director Cameron Meyer Shorb on how guilt and shame became his biggest source of suffering and what helped. Therapist Tim LeBon on the trap of moral perfectionism and why we should strive for excellence instead. Researcher Hannah Ritchie on feeling like an imposter even after writing a book and giving a TED Talk. Moral philosopher Will MacAskill on why he's 5 to 10 times happier than he used to be after learning to work in a way that's genuinely sustainable. Researcher Christian Ruhl on pursuing a high-impact career while managing a stutter. Mercy for Animals CEO Leah Garcés on why it's so important to insist on self-care when witnessing trauma regularly. And Vox journalist Kelsey Piper on recognizing that you're not alone in your struggles. I hope you enjoy revisiting these moments as much as I did.
80,000 Hours former CEO Howie on what his anxiety and self-doubt feels like.
Basically, I think I'm on a day-to-day basis dealing with mental illness just about every day of my life, even when I'm not having a acute episode of anything in particular. And so for me, what this means is part of it is just having sort of a lower mood set point than most people. Experience a wide range of emotions. But my sort of baseline, I think, is just lower than a more mentally healthy person's would be. I think that's one bit of it. I struggle with sort of inappropriate amounts of, or I guess at least maladaptive amounts of guilt pretty frequently. I have a very bad case of imposter syndrome. So when at the end of the year, every time we do our performance evaluations, we do sort of a self-evaluation, and then your boss and people who work with you evaluate your performance. And the difference between the way that I see my work and the way that people around me apparently see my work is just laughable. So I go around day by day, just thinking I am doing a very bad job which, sucks. And then I struggle with anxiety a lot. So I think I probably lose hours of work time to anxiety in sort of like an average normal week when I'm doing what's like doing well for me. To give an example of what that means for me, to have like weekly check-ins with my boss. At some points in time, it was Holden who runs Open Phil. At some points, it was Ellie who like runs GiveWell. And so like the hour before those check-ins, I would like basically not be able to work for that hour because of like the level of anxiety that I felt. And it was like guilt and anxiety because every time I had to reflect on like, how did the last week go? The answer was always, you didn't do enough. You didn't meet your expectations of yourself. Now you have to like tell this person that. It wasn't really about telling them though. It was more about like, now you have to confront the fact that like you failed again. And so like every week before that meeting, like lose an hour of like being productive to just really unuseful negative self-talk.
So for people who have never had that kind of experience before, is there a way to give a sense of like what that actually feels like, that hour?
Yeah. So varies for different people. Anxiety, I think, generally has both physical symptoms and like cognitive and psychological symptoms. Some people only have one or the other. Some people have both. But yeah, for me, the physical symptoms, it basically feels like being chased by a bear or like chased by a lion or like something like that. So it's like having your like fight or flight response that is supposed to be adapted to like evolving out in the savannah and having like a predator going after you. Except the thing that you're actually worried about is, can I like in the last hour before this meeting get 3 more projects done so I can like feel good about my week, which is like isn't reasonable in the first place. But like, so you're like sitting at a computer trying to reason through some difficult research papers, but being like, there's just like a lion chasing you the entire time is like basically my experience with it. And there's like a cognitive cycle associated with it too. So for me, it's just like a lot of repetitive thoughts of like, you fucked up again, you're not going to be able to do this. You fucked up again, you're not going to be able to do this. Like that flavor of thing. Or like, okay, you said that you would get this much done in the next hour before the meeting. It's now been 2 minutes. You weren't productive in those 2 minutes. Oh God, does that mean you're not going to be productive for this entire time? And like the line just gets faster. And then it's like, oh, well, now the line's faster. So I'm like even less able to write it. And so now it's been 10 minutes and I haven't started. And then like the line like really fucking speeds up. So there's sort of like a real feedback loop between like the cognitive stuff and like the thoughts and then the physical symptoms for me.
Evolutionary psychiatrist Randy Nesse on what emotions are for.
So I looked at evolutionary approaches, and most of them were saying, what's the function of anger? What's the function of anxiety? What's the function of depression? And I asked myself, well, how do these emotions come to be? And the answer is that they're suites of coordinated responses that change lots of things physiologically and cognitively and behaviorally to cope with a particular kind of situation that's recurred over evolutionary time. So people who felt the hot breath of a tiger on their shoulder and a lion is salivating in front of them, who experienced the emotion of awe, those genes didn't stick around at all. They became lion lunch. While people who had this coordinated response that we call a panic attack or a fight-flight reaction, where they start sweating and they run really fast and they breathe really fast and their heart pounds and their muscles get tight, those people were more likely to survive. And so natural selection shaped a very specialized emergency response we call a panic attack. And all of a sudden, with that insight, which I'd never quite had before, I realized, gosh, every emotion needs to be understood not in terms of its function, which was the prevailing evolutionary view, and the still continuing evolutionary view by many people, but instead, in what situation is this emotion useful, or was it useful for our ancestors? And this also solved one of the biggest conundrums about emotion research. I mean, are the emotions separate little entities, or are they all overlapping on dimensions? No, you think about this from an evolutionary viewpoint, and they're like overlapping boughs on a tree because they all evolved from each other. So this made sense of emotions. So the question is, in what situation is anxiety useful? And the answer to that is fairly, in situations where you're in danger of losing something, it's good to have a special mode of operation that alerts you to the possible loss where you can take preventive action and avoid that situation in the future. So, and the next thing that happens is, hey, is there only one kind of loss? No, you can lose your finger, you can lose your friend, you can lose your mate's fidelity, you can lose your money, you can lose your health, you can fall off a building. And this helps to explain why there's so many different kinds of anxiety. Natural selection is gradually and only partially differentiated kinds of anxiety to cope with those different kinds of possible losses. I mean, I always thought that natural selection would shape us for health and happiness and cooperation and long, happy lives. And anything different from that meant there's something wrong with the system. But once you start studying how evolution shapes behavior regulation mechanisms, you realize that it doesn't give a damn about us. It doesn't give a damn about anything. It's a mindless process, that any genes that make individuals do things that benefit transmitting more genes, which basically means having more children and taking good care of them and getting resources to do that. Any genes that make that happen will become more frequent. Any tendencies genetically to do things that make your life end sooner or have fewer offspring or have fewer resources, those are going to go away. And the whole system doesn't care at all. A lot of our bad feelings are about things that have to do with reproduction. And we should pause just a moment and note that Freud was right about one thing for sure. He said, ultimately, it all comes down to sex. And, it's not sex, it's reproduction. And when sex is just one small part of having offspring and taking good care of them and raising them to a point where they can reproduce. But, fundamentally, all of these systems are designed to maximize numbers of offspring and the benefits to relatives. And a lot of times that makes us miserable. Bad things happen to our kids. Hey, that's not us. But we're wired appropriately so to feel really, really bad if our kids are not doing well, and we try to help them. So these are things that are built in. You don't want to change them because that would be awful to lose that kind of feeling. For sex, it's more of a different matter. When people can't have sex, they really, really hate it. And that's pre-wired, I think. It'd be nice to just tell yourself, I shouldn't care about that because that's about my genes and not me. But actually, that doesn't help a bit. Striving for status, however, a lot of your work with 80,000 hours, I think, has to do with people pursuing careers. And it's always a challenge to figure out how grand a goal to set and what to do when you're not making progress towards a relatively grand goal. And this whole line of research has made me change how I see patients. And it used to be that I would always encourage patients, keep trying, never give up. Your difficulty trying to do this is because of your depression. Don't let the depression get the better of you. And as I got older and I saw that not everybody can succeed in everything they're doing in life, I started just listening more and being more sympathetic and saying, gosh, can we talk more about why you feel you really have to apply to medical school for a fifth time? Or to somebody else, can we talk more about why this is the only woman for you in the world and you feel like you shouldn't go on living unless this person will love you? So often people are pursuing something that's very, very important and you sympathize with them. And I think the key to good therapy in these situations is not just to tell them, don't pay attention to your depression. And it's not to just tell them, you're never going to succeed at that, give up. The thing is to talk with them about, gosh, do you think that's working? How much effort do you want to keep putting into this? Are there other things that would be better for you and your family than continuing to put in this effort towards getting that particular promotion or making that particular person respect you? On the other hand, it's not a simple job because we all spend our lives pursuing unreachable goals. And the people who succeed grandly very often are the people who do pursue giant goals and fail over and over again and keep trying. So nothing simple here.
Therapist Hannah Boettcher on how striving for impact can affect our self-worth.
I also think there are some cultural norms that are common in high-impact spaces that can amplify imposter syndrome a bit.
Oh, really?
So the sorts of questions that people are well-practiced asking about their projects, things like, where are the top problems? Which of these is neglected? How could we be doing better? If we're doing things that aren't a value add, we need to stop doing them, right? These sorts of questions that are useful for impact can easily start being applied to the self, where they pull for a deficit frame, right? And then there's also this sort of cultural norm or virtue around self-critique and humility, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
if you are, let's say, like complimented for your work, somebody in a high impact space is probably going to be ready with an internal yeah, but, right? Because that's a move that's really well practiced in these spaces.
Right. Totally. Okay. Yeah. So just to dig in a bit more on a few of those things. Some people are trying to do a lot of good. Some people, they're trying to do the most good they can. And in either case, maybe much more than is typical, we end up asking things like, is what we're doing good enough? Could we be doing more good? Do we have the right beliefs, or could we have the righter beliefs?
Yes.
Is this project that I'm working on going fine? How can I guess all the ways it could go wrong so that it could go better? And I guess it's such a optimization framing that ending up anywhere below optimal, which we don't even know what optimal is oftentimes. So it's often pretty easy to tell a story where we are below optimal, then we're setting ourselves up to feel inadequate, I guess. And
Exactly.
I think I both stand by the goal of trying to find ways to do better and to do more good. But how do you do that in a way that doesn't also end up making you feel kind of chronically inadequate? Because like you could always have done the project better, or you could always be kind of reflecting more on your beliefs to make sure that you've got the right ideas about what the most pressing problems are or something.
I have a few thoughts on this. I think we are aiming for a place where we can decouple the scorecard from our worthiness, right? So it's, of course, the case that in trying to optimize the good, we will always be falling short, right? The question is how much and in what ways are we not there yet? And if we then extrapolate that to how much and in what ways am I not enough, that's where we run into trouble. And I think that we miss the fundamental difference between performance and worthiness, and that we want to keep that difference vivid.
Luisa Rodriguez on grieving the gap between who you are and who you wish you were.
I believe it would be better for me to feel less guilt because, like, yeah, we're making this assumption that I do think is totally plausible and probably even likely that, like, me feeling less guilt about this would just be better in the long run.
Yeah.
And I believe that I'm just kind of along for the ride of like how much my brain and body want to work.
Mm-hmm.
Then what would it be like to, on the day-to-day, try to conjure those ideas up when feeling guilty? Yeah, I mean, like, I'm just trying to remember a time last week, for example. Yeah, there was a day when I felt stressed and sad. And so I could tell I was getting really distracted when trying to work and that it wasn't working and that I should go for a walk instead. But like felt a bit guilty about that walk because it was in the middle of a work day and probably people would have expected me to be at my computer. I guess that's kind of an easy case because like upon reflection, I just like really think it was just good for me to take the walk.
Yeah.
If it gets a bit more ambiguous and I'm just like, I really want to go for a walk, which sometimes happens. If it's like a really gorgeous day, I live in Oxford. And so if it's good weather, I'm like really drawn to it.
So like with a lot of these ones, to me, whenever you talk about stuff like this, I think what you are feeling guilty about is not being a different person. That's what you're saying. You're saying I should be a different person.
Yeah.
I think that makes about as much sense as me saying, I wish I was really tall and amazing at basketball because then I could join the NBA and I would make millions of people happy and they would watch me and they would buy my jerseys. You know, we both agree that is like ludicrous. That's what it like reads to me when you're saying like, I wish I was the type of person who didn't want to go for walks during the day.
Yeah.
I'm like, but you are like,
right.
And I also like independently think that that's like a totally fine and good and healthy thing to do.
Sure.
But even if it wasn't, it's like, okay, well, that's the world we're in. We're in the world where you like to take walks. Okay, like what is there to feel shame about? I mean, it's just that's just who you are.
Yeah,
you can't do anything about it.
This is getting to the daylight between us. So yeah, and I think we did get in the direction of like will I endorse this or won't I upon reflection? But I feel enormous grief about the things that I am not in a way that you don't. And in a way that I guess, like, for the most part, I don't think is adding anything to my life. It's just taking it away. It's not making things better. But like, I feel grief that I'm not smarter. I feel grief that I'm not more curious. I feel grief that I don't work harder. And so I guess often on the day-to-day, it feels like guilt. But even if I look through this lens and I'm like, but you can't have done otherwise, then I'm just like, ugh, that's so disappointing. I'm the kind of person who like has my features.
Right.
And they're unchangeable.
Yeah. So there's two things that I think of here. One is asking you, do you ever feel joyful and appreciative of the fact that you are very smart and very curious and very hardworking, even if you think you could be even smarter and even more curious and even more hardworking? Do you ever like, or that's like off the table?
Do I feel appreciative of those things? Doesn't really come up.
No. Okay. So the world we're in is one where you are like at least 9 out of 10 on all of these things, right? And yeah, it's like you feel like grief even for not being a 10 in these things. Let's say you're a 9. If you just grant me you're a 9.
Fine.
and that you're not a 10. And I would just say like, well, you're like in the body of someone who has a 9 all of these things, and you're also someone who values these things. Like that seems pretty great. But yeah, you just like, you can't go to a 10. You can't go to an 8. You're a 9. Okay. Mm-hmm. It's not possible to change, but it's also not a shame. Like there's no like problem to this. Like there are some things about most people's lives that really are a shame, where you're like, I don't know, you have like chronic knee pain or something. You're like, ugh, that sucks. That's really bad. But you don't feel the same thing, right? Like if you had chronic knee pain, you wouldn't feel this like shame of like, oh, why don't I have good knees? Like why aren't my knees perfect? Why don't I have 10 out of 10 knees?
But I would feel grief. I would feel sad. I would feel loss. But
not shame. Not shame or like associated guilt. Like, you know, because you're saying like, whatever, I wish I was harder working, and then I feel guilty for not working harder. But it comes back to this, like, I feel bad for not being a different person.
Yeah, but I think I'm actually able to make that move with you. But then what I'm left with is the sadness. And that also feels bad.
Okay.
So I feel like there's like actually another move we have to make before Luisa just feels a bunch less pain.
Totally. So here's my next attempt.
Okay, great.
Okay, so I don't know if you like endorse this. I think that the important thing is just like good being done in the universe, right? Like it's just like that's the thing that ultimately matters. And I am like truly like indifferent between you or I doing good, right? If I did like 1 unit of good and you did 99 units of good, or it was 50-50, it's like whatever. It's just like good being done in the universe. I'd be like happy either way. Like it wouldn't matter to me. And it seems like you wouldn't be happy that way.
One
side of this, right? You feel shame about, but like one thing is like you don't hold me to these standards, right? Like of like me not working hard enough. Like it's all, so it's all just internal. Which I understand. So I'm like risking like causing more shame here by you being like, oh, why am I so egotistical? And then I want to say like, oh, but you couldn't do otherwise. You really literally couldn't do otherwise. It's not like you could sort of do otherwise. It's you could not do otherwise. Like you're you, I'm me. We will do exactly as much good as we're going to do. We're just along for the ride. Hopefully it's good for the sake of the universe. But, you know, there's just nothing you can do.
Charity director Cameron Meyer Shorb on managing work-related guilt and shame.
You reached out with the loveliest email of all time to let us know that you got a lot from the chat Kieran and I had about free will and guilt. Do you want to say what your experience with work-related guilt and shame has been like?
Yeah. partly this is because my life is generally pretty good, but also it's partly because my guilt is so bad that work-related guilt and shame is by far the biggest source of suffering in my life. Like, just a kind of, maybe it's not every day, but it is almost every week. I feel really, just caught up in worrying about whether I've done enough or how bad it was of me to not do enough, or am I working enough hours? And there are varying degrees of this. It's an almost constant presence. Like a lot of my experience of my work day to day is like, remember, like you would be a bad person if you didn't do more of this. And then sometimes it has gotten so bad where I've like lost entire afternoons or entire days to sort of like procrastinating because this turns into such an aversive set of feelings. Once in 2020, this like kind of merged with my proclivity for depression to get bad enough that like I was, I think, a liability to the organization. And I asked my manager to like consider firing me and like lay out a plan for
Cam.
what improvement would look like. And then I got therapy and medication at just the right time, but like it can get really, really bad. So that is part of why it was so cool to hear an episode about it.
That's really, very, very moving to me. And thank you for sharing. And also, really, really wonderful to hear that the episode resonated. Yeah, I guess some listeners had this worry that you still need guilt and shame to create the kind of determined motivation to be productive. Did you have any of that reaction, or do you have a way of thinking about that for yourself?
Yeah, that was definitely my inclination for a long time. Okay, so first of all, this might not apply to everyone. People vary a lot. But for me, like the bittersweet reality is guilt and shame just do not work at all. Or maybe they work sometimes, but there's a lot of times when they're just really, really counterproductive, when they make my experience of work so aversive that I end up avoiding work because I want to avoid the guilt and shame. And then, that just destroys the thing. So for me, for better or for worse, it's just simple enough. Like, no, this doesn't work. I've tried so many ways of trying to make this work and it doesn't. The reason I think that this might apply to many or all people, or at least that I think it's really worth taking these ideas seriously and trying this out, even if it's not what you end up sticking with, is that guilt and shame, they're just inaccurate feelings. Like they tell a story about the world that is not true. Like the story they tell is like, if I tried harder, then I would have worked more. And so then like you learn the wrong lesson, which is like, oh, next time I'm just going to like magically be a person that tries harder. Whereas if you step away from the guilt and shame and you just look at every, moment or hour as a retrospective, then you can actually identify the actual conditions or mechanisms that are leading you to be more or less productive. And you can notice like, oh, I noticed I was less productive on days when I was more tired, or on tasks that I enjoyed less, or when I was thinking about these other things, right? And those things aren't always in your control, but sometimes they're in your control in as much as you can ever control things. And I really feel like it has helped me just learn better how to set myself up for work. And yeah, I noticed too, there was something about like a sense of self or identity that the shame was reinforcing. It's like, oh, I'm not like, I don't know. It's something about like, I'm a person who cares so much. I only would have made this mistake if I wasn't trying hard enough. But actually the answer is like, no, I'm like a dumb meat machine that is subject to physical and emotional constraints. And I should just really learn how to work this machine, not like magically be a better martyr.
Yeah. I resonate with that a lot.
Yeah, and I think the flip side of this is it's a more useful way of thinking about things, but it is also a harder question to answer, right? Like the question of why didn't I work long enough or hard enough? If you just, because I just didn't try hard enough, bam, there's your answer, there's your certainty. And you give yourself this illusion at least of like knowing how to fix it next time. But dang, there are so many confounding variables when you look at how productive you are at any one day. And it's really frustrating to not know and like not have that sense of control about how to set yourself up perfectly the next day. But important work is worth doing and worth doing well and worth, spending a while studying how you do it and what sets you up to do it well. So I think it's worth asking the more complicated question.
therapist Tim LeBon on aiming for excellence rather than perfection.
What is this moral perfectionism? It would be very similar, except instead of focusing just on achievement, it would be focusing on your moral worth. So your identity is linked with how good you are as a person. And then the standards would again be unfeasibly high and inflexible. Maybe something like doing the most good you can, to coin a phrase,
hypothetically,
every moment of the day.
Yeah, sounds tough.
Does sound very tough. And then again, so you'd worry about not doing it. You would procrastinate. You might even avoid some tasks because you avoid being in the public glare because you fear you might fail. And then if you didn't succeed, or you thought you hadn't succeeded in reaching that target, which of course you won't because it's such a tough target, sometimes you won't succeed in having a really fantastic outcome in everything you do, then you'll be very harsh self-criticism. And very often a result of that is shame. And shame, for any listeners out there, I'm sure there are lots of them who've listened to Brené Brown and similar TED Talks and writings. Shame is one of the least constructive emotions. Guilt can be quite a useful emotion, but shame is where you just feel like hiding away. So very often you just feel like escaping, so you don't get help, and you're just left with this feeling of very often self-hatred, self-loathing, because remember, your whole identity is wrapped up with being this really good person. You've set yourself a incredibly high, unfeasible standard to do that. You haven't achieved it, and then you're just left there on your own, thinking that you failed and that you're a terrible person.
Yeah.
And so that would be moral perfectionism. I don't know if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, completely. I guess you could see how this could be both an intoxicating mix to start with, and also creates a positive feedback loop that can get people into serious trouble, where feeling ashamed and feeling terrible about yourself is not super conducive to then going and working really hard, or at least a lot of the time that's going to be then an impediment to reaching those standards, because you're just having negative thoughts all the time and worrying that you're not going to meet the standards, and then maybe you actually will stop even reaching like ordinary people's standards, and then you're stuck in this like negative feedback loop of negative self-image and like not being able to act and so on.
That's exactly it. And yeah, so depression and anxiety, sometimes at clinical levels, can come out at the bottom of this. And then, as you said, once you're in that, then it's actually very hard to just reach the normal standards. And then that would go back to saying, oh God, I really am such a terrible person. Because people like that tend to also have a very high sense of responsibility and tend not to make allowances for themselves. And as I said, if they also are full of shame, they won't actually get positive feedback from other people so much because they're hiding it. So it's a really difficult mixture.
Yeah. What's distinctive about treating people with this issue as opposed to, I guess, other mental health issues that people come to you with?
I have to say, and not just because some of them might be listening, that it is a pleasure to work with people who identify as effective altruists, and that includes many of them might be perfectionists. And why is that? It's because they're bright, they're conscientious, they're super motivated, and they're generally just nice people. What you've got is people who are super motivated with a real problem. You know, we're not just talking about people who are just having a little bit of therapy because, you know, there's a luxury. This is something that can very often cause clinical levels of depression and anxiety and stop them doing what is most important to them, which is making a positive impact on the world. So I enjoy working with effective altruists. And of course, from my own perspective, if I do help them, then it means I'm helping people who will then go on to do a lot of good.
Yeah.
So that's another little benefit.
Yeah, nice. You mentioned that many people come in with this sort of cluster of issues, I guess identifying that something is not going great in their life, but they don't necessarily think of themselves as perfectionists. Are there any who do, or is it hard to persuade people that they have perfectionism if they're reluctant to think that? And I suppose, do you think it's your place to try to persuade people to see their life that way if they don't view themselves as having this issue?
I think there's the word perfectionism to get over. And if they haven't said they were perfectionist, but they talk about some of these kind of the maintaining processes happening, which would be, you know, often people tell me that I set the bar too high, and sometimes I procrastinate, and I'm quite harsh with myself when I don't meet them. Then you'd be picking up possible clinical perfectionism, and then there would be a discussion about whether this was a good thing or not. So very often, an important phase very early on in therapy for perfectionism is the pros and cons of their current way of being. Sometimes we draw out a little table of perfectionism versus excellence, because they're not the same thing. So, for instance, perfectionism is aiming at something with perfect, and search for excellence is something excellent, and they're not quite the same thing.
One of them is more achievable.
One of them is more achievable. And again, perfection would be something that was very subjective as well, and ultimately unattainable. Whereas excellence is something that you can have certain skills and you can train yourself to achieve it. You say, which would you rather go for? All this stuff on this left-hand column, which is the perfection stuff, which is generally unattainable, or this stuff on the right-hand column, which is excellence. And generally, they would say, yeah, let's go for excellence. Then you're kind of getting people to understand that it might be the search for perfection that's the problem. Because what people don't want to be is mediocre. So they're saying, Tim, you just want me to be rubbish. You want me to, I know X, Y, and Z who just don't do anything. They waste their lives. You want me to be like that? They don't say that usually because they're too polite, but
that's the fear.
But you see that in the body language. It's not even necessarily about lowering your standards that much. It's about the standards perhaps being more, as I said, flexible and attainable. So, for instance, if someone has a physical health condition, then it wouldn't be fair to then assume that they can reach the same standards, do the same things as they would if they didn't have it.
Or just always be hitting the same level regardless of how their physical health issue is going.
Exactly.
Author Cal Newport on making time to be alone with our thoughts.
Something that's generally true of the books, I think, is that they're very good for people who need to notice that the way that they're setting goals or the way that they're working to achieve those goals kind of don't make the most sense and can be improved. But I think there's another somewhat independent driver of unhappiness at work and low productivity that they're somewhat less aimed at addressing, which is emotional, personal barriers that people have to doing what matters. And these can come in a lot of different forms, but a few which I think most people will find relatable to some degree is things like not wanting to do the most important thing on your to-do list because it's challenging and it's high stakes. And so you're scared or anxious about finding out that you've done a bad job or doing a bad job. And so you put it off and put it off. Or like wanting to obfuscate how things get done because you're scared that you're not actually as productive as your colleagues. I mean, maybe you are, maybe you aren't. But either way, that really worries you, kind of brings social anxiety. Or finding it's hard to say no to doing things because you want to please people and it generates this immediate self-esteem boost to your image to say yes. Yeah, in your mind, is there an important distinction between these organizational systems issues that push people to spend time unproductively and these emotional, like personal motivations that pull people to, check Slack and email all day, even if no one's really making them do it?
Yeah, I think they're both really important. On my podcast, for example, I talk a lot about the deep life as a sort of goal or approach or philosophical a philosophical adaptation of how you approach life that deploys some of these systematic or systems-based thinking as part of this larger, I think, a more philosophical goal. One of the things, for example, that I think is an issue with what you're just talking about is the answer to a lot of those comes in part from better self-awareness built through sort of extensive self-reflection and development, right? And one of the things that we're increasingly losing right now is this interesting techno experiment we're doing. So we're increasingly losing time alone with our own thoughts because, hey, we have a portable supercomputer with a ubiquitous high-speed broadband internet connection, the servers that are optimized to show us exactly what we want to see in any moment that's going to be entertaining or engaging. Yes, that gets rid of the necessity of having to be alone with our own thoughts, but being alone with our own thoughts is critical because it's how we make sense of ourselves. It's how we make sense of what scares us, what we're proud of, what's not going well, what we want to go well. It's how we get in touch with these intimations we have about what's good and what's not and what's important and what's not. Self-reflection is how we actually make sense of those and build a structure for our life around them. And these are structures with which we can actually do the scary thing. We can make forward progress. It's the structure on which we can build the application of all these type of systems. But without it, we're just flying from thing to thing driven by emotion and anxiety and numbing. And so one thing I think we should all prioritize is getting to know ourselves better, time alone with ourselves. What is this thing I just saw, this interview I just heard, this book I just read? What does that make me feel? What do I think about it? Am I going to file some of that away in my brain or am I completely rejecting this? What do I care about? How do I feel about these things? We have to have those internal schemas of self-understanding. And when those are lacking, I completely agree with you. I mean, you can hear all the work in the world, all the words about career capital and deep work and about the hyperactive hive mind and cognitive optimization. And, to what end if you don't actually have a firm foundation on which you're actually building what you want to build with your life?
Yeah, did you have a book recommendation for people who feel like, yeah, I relate to this as kind of being a key barrier for me?
Yeah, well, no, my book recommendation would be read a lot of books, and not my like pragmatic nonfiction books or advice books. read books, read good literature, read good nonfiction that's more interesting or memoir based, or is going to push big ideas. I mean, read things. You can read the classics like Viktor Frankl, but read like Matt Crawford's Shop Class of Soulcraft. Like read thought-provoking, engaging books. Read philosophy. If you're not comfortable with hard philosophy yet, read the secondary sources about the philosophy, right? And then think. And just you need to start to create a life of the mind. A life of the mind is where you can actually start to construct a conception of the self. And when you have a conception of the self, you can start to do good things. So we need to think more. We need more things to think about. So my book I recommend is lots of books.
Yeah.
What I recommend is going from, I don't read books just for provocative self-reflection to I do. That's the biggest recommendation I would give.
80,000 Hours career advisors Michelle Hutchinson and Habiba Islam on prioritizing mental health over career impact.
So I guess one other thing that comes up is, I guess, talking about kind of people's prioritizations around different priorities in their life, and sort of impact is not like the only thing that you're aiming for in your career. And I think often I do just give people a message if they're struggling with mental health related things to like prioritize that, put that first. And obviously not a counseling service, don't have expertise in this area, but I do think this is something that I do try and like emphasize to people and give people permission to focus on that kind of thing. And I think it's kind of helpful to have an outside person sometimes say that. Like often recommend the podcast that Kieran did with one of the 80K staff members on their sort of own journey here.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think there's definitely some subset of people that we talk to who feel like they're only doing what they ought to if they do the most impactful thing they possibly could and spend all their time and all their money helping others. And that doesn't seem like a recipe for actually having an impactful career, because you're likely to burn yourself out. And I don't think we should be in the business of pushing ourselves and each other that hard. I think it's very important to find a career that's actually going to be fulfilling and sustainable for you, and that allows you the amount of time off that you need. And then also for us to support each other insofar as we can. And the wider world also isn't always that good at really taking seriously the amount of mental health help that people need and things. And I feel pretty fortunate to be in a community of people where people are pretty happy to talk through mental health challenges that you might have and what kinds of things you can do about them, and whether it's a good idea to try meditation or try a CBT app or go to counseling and that kind of thing. And I definitely want us to be, as Habiba said, not counselors, and therefore pretty careful about the kinds of things that we say, but encourage people to be open and seek help and kind of destigmatize mental health as much as possible.
Sounds like a trap that some people might fall into is they're like having some personal problem, like potentially a health issue, and they feel like despite that, they still have to like focus directly on trying to have impact right away. And potentially that can be putting the cart before the horse. Like what they need to do is deal with their health problems or whatever is making it difficult for them to progress in their life or their career. And then they can think, once they've dealt with the like underlying challenges, then they can get back to thinking about the career aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is the sort of analogy of in an airplane, like putting on your own oxygen mask first before you then help even like the sort of people that you're traveling with or your children or something. That's like always, that's the standard advice.
Yeah. I guess the trap, people might feel like it's self-indulgent in some way, or potentially that's like a negative self-talk that people can get into. That's like taking care of themselves is just selfishness and silliness.
I think that's very unhelpful self-talk.
Yeah,
And like, just like, it isn't going to lead to the kind of the best outcomes in general. Like even if the thing that you're caring about is like having the most impact, I think it's like counterproductive self-talk.
Yeah, I think it's also just incredibly hard when you're in this kind of mind space to zoom out. I found while I was pregnant, I felt very tired and lethargic and not very inclined to work, and found that kind of difficult from an identity point of view, because I felt like somehow I had turned into a lazy kind of person and not like I could cut myself slack for that. And in that kind of case, it was just very directly obvious what was causing it and that it was time bounded. But it was still very hard to just say, okay, I just won't work as hard for these few months. And I think it's just so much worse when you have a chronic health problem where you don't know when it's going to get better and you feel like you really have to push through now, when in fact it could be better to zoom out and say, well, this year is going to be a year when I focus on figuring out whether I can do anything about my underlying health, and maybe don't even do that, but just cut myself slack and have an easy year of it. And when looked at from the point of view of a 50-year career, that's just totally reasonable.
Yeah. Maybe another thing that could be psychologically helpful is to think about this from the perspective of the community again, as like a group of people. It's like we should have some kind of trade system where people who have good mental health or like good health in any given year, they work like they work extra hard and push themselves a bit more. And people who are having a hard time, they do a trade across time where they'll work harder when they're doing better again personally. But then this is the year when they get to chill out a little bit more and like think more about getting back on track personally.
Yeah, I think being part of a community is hugely helpful. And another way in which the community can be helpful is just reminding each other, you know, when you're not the one in the difficult space, it's much easier for you to take the zoomed out point of view. I had a late term stillbirth, which was pretty difficult for me. And I was really grateful to the people in the community who were just, with hindsight, I think, like very sensibly telling me to take things easy and not having any specific expectations of what I would do, and suggest a bunch of like, should I go traveling? Should I just take things easy for ages? Should I work if I actually want to? And I think having people around you at those kinds of times who clearly share your values and so aren't just being totally biased, but are saying, hey, now's the time to zoom out and look after yourself, can be incredibly useful.
Charity founder Sarah Eustis-Guthrie on the ups and downs of founding an organization.
I think part of it is that when you run an organization, you feel very personally responsible for what's happening with that organization. And I think this felt extra strong for us because not only had we decided to found this organization, but we decided to found this organization as opposed to other organizations that could have been really, really good. And so like that was my co-founder and I kind of like staking our claim for like, we think that this is good. We think that this is so good that we want you to give money that you otherwise could give to these other really compelling organizations. And then not only that, but, you know, I'm good friends with a lot of other folks in the charity entrepreneurship community, which is great. They're an awesome group of people. But what that means is that sometimes I'll be chatting with someone and like in the nicest possible way, it's like their program's going phenomenally. They're helping so many people. They're getting this huge grant. And even though I think people make an effort to make it non-stressful and like non-competitive, it's such a warm community. It also just is inherently, you're sitting there and you're thinking, man, is it the intervention or is it me? And it's yeah, not the best feeling ever. I think my overall experience with charity entrepreneurship, with founding an org, was that the benefits were a lot bigger than I'd expected. And then the downsides were a lot bigger than I expected. And I think I would go back and do it again. And I would recommend other people do it. But also, I did not comprehend how big of a change in my life it would be. And I don't want to say that this happens for everyone, because I think people have very different experiences with it. But I think for me, that sense of responsibility, that sense of like feeling like the results really reflected on me, which I don't fully endorse as a take and was something that I was trying to shift away from, but I found really tough because it was just true that for some aspects of the program, how well they went were like a direct reflection of how good of a job I did. And sometimes I would make a mistake and that would have bad effects in the world. And that was really stressful. And then some aspects of the program had very little to do with how hard I was working or how smart I was about making a particular choice. And I think that I found that to be immensely stressful. And I found it hard to turn off thinking about the organization. I would try to do these things like, hey, I won't check Slack after I stop work for the day and that kind of thing. But what I found is just I'd be walking around my life. And because this was like the most interesting and felt like the most important thing coming up in my life, that's what I would think about. So yeah, I did have this experience of I would wake up in the middle of the night to get a drink of water. And before I was even fully conscious, I would find that I was thinking about the organization or I was thinking about some of these issues, and then it would be hard to fall back asleep. And I've talked to other people who say, yeah, I have that exact same experience.
Wow. Yeah, I'm trying to think of an analogy, and I'm finding it hard to, but it sounds closer to like, I don't know, having a child or something. Like you're like trying to like create this thing, and there's so much responsibility and personal ownership in a way that you just don't have in most cases when you are employed by a place to do a thing. And like the bottom line responsibility isn't with you.
Right. And I think there's a lot of jobs where people have that sense of real responsibility. And I do think that there are good aspects of this. Like I found it deeply satisfying and deeply fulfilling. I remember when I was thinking about applying to jobs before this, I was thinking, you know, I want to have this feeling that if I work extra, if I'm working extra hard, that that'll make more good things happen in the world. I don't want to have this feeling of, oh, I'm accruing additional profit to a corporation, or, oh, it doesn't really matter that much how hard I work. But this is the flip side of that. This is the flip side where when it matters how good of a job you do, it's hard to let go of. And also, I do just think there is a big difference between being the person who's running the organization and then being someone who has a really substantial role, because ultimately so much of your job is making these really tough calls that you could potentially invest infinite time into. So it's really hard to know, when did I make a good decision? When did I invest the correct amount of time into making a decision? There's a lot that's really tough. And I think having a co-founder does make a big difference. There are some folks that solo found. I have so much respect for that. I could not have done that with MHI, but having a co-founder makes a big difference because you can really share that burden. And I also think having a community makes a big difference, where I would talk to other folks running orgs and say, oh my gosh, I found this thing immensely stressful and I don't know if I made the right call. And they would say, I felt the exact same way. And then also having advisors who we could turn to. And I think that helps take on some of that responsibility that's similar to having a manager. But I didn't totally trust that our advisors would be telling us in the frankest possible way if we were totally messing up. And so it was hard. I felt like I had to carry that burden myself. And so I ended up doing a lot of second guessing myself, a lot of asking myself, am I messing up? Am I doing a good job? And in retrospect, I wish I'd done more to try and offload that. But I think it's fundamentally just a super, super tough challenge.
Yeah, it sounds brutal.
Our World in Data researcher Hannah Ritchie on feeling like an imposter as a generalist.
Yeah, is there anything else that feels particularly hard about your work?
I think like I feel this personally, but I think it's also like something that's like I'm sure like affects other people at Our World in Data, like especially in recent years, is the platform like has grown a lot in recent years. Like a larger part to do with COVID, because we became like the COVID data people. And we had a large audience before that, but I think it's just shifted a lot. And now I think there's just a really intense pressure to get things right. Like people take our work very seriously. Often they'll frame it as like, I look at our own data and I take as gospel, like what you see on the website, and I just assume that that's true. Which is like I
have the same worries at 80,000 hours, but yeah, go on.
Which is like a very high bar. And like, obviously we do a ton to make sure that we are getting everything right. But there is like a lot of pressure there and concern that like one error could like have like pretty bad consequences, like either in terms of like a decision that's made or just reputationally. Like I think Our World in Data, we always feel like we're just like one mistake away from our reputation being bashed.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds really anxiety inducing.
Yeah.
It's like you're doing a bunch of excellent work, but it could just be one or a few mistakes that make it all, I guess, reputationally tarnished.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like on a personal level, I think part of what's difficult is we cover so many different topics. Like it's really, really broad, like the topics that we cover. But to some extent, I also like straddle a lot of disciplines in some sense. Like we're researchers, we're data analysts, we're writers, we do data viz. So I think there's this like imposter syndrome that comes from like straddling so many different things at once.
Yeah. I've totally found that with, work that feels kind of generalist-y, where you try to be good at many things, but then you're never exceptionally good at a single thing. And so when you're in a space about that thing, you feel like you don't know as much as other people, and you in fact probably don't. To solve problems like agricultural productivity and poverty in sub-Saharan Africa, you must need to think about like 10 different disciplines. And then I could totally imagine how you'd then just feel like you don't know enough about any one of them.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely feeling where, like, in that sense, I'm sure, like in the back of my head, I'm like, the agricultural economist's not going to agree what I say. Probably the
Right.
the soil scientist's not going to agree what I say. The agri-tech company is not going to. So like, when you straddle so many different disciplines, it almost feels like none of the experts are really going to agree with what you're saying, because you're trying to mix them up and come up with like a true, but in some sense simplified narrative that people can understand.
Yeah, that sounds really hard. And I guess the flip side is like, none of those experts can come up with a full kind of multidisciplinary, multidimensional solution. Like the soil expert will have advice on soil, but they won't be able to look at the problem as a whole and think about what all the possible solutions are, and point to some of the best ones, which feels like a huge limitation. But I guess it sounds like your brain is, understandably, and mine would too, focusing on the ways that you're not as expert as them, even though you might be able to offer more insights into like big problems. Have you made any progress on feeling less impostery? Has anything helped?
I think the way I respond to it, like, sometimes like differs a bit. Like, I think to some extent, the imposter syndrome has benefited me professionally. Like my imposter syndrome often leads to anxiety, like, as I said, about getting stuff right, and like it often seems very high stakes. And I think like professionally, it's just very good if I'm like really paranoid about getting stuff right.
Right. If you're meticulous and perfectionist.
To that extent, it's benefited me professionally, even if personally, like, it has quite a high toll on how I feel.
That's interesting. In my own struggle with imposter syndrome, I've found overall it's hindered my ability to do good work more than it's helped. But I guess in some types of roles, that type of anxiety where you're worried about making a mistake, if mistakes really are just extremely, extremely bad, can be helpful.
Yeah, I think there's two sides to it. I think overall it's been a benefit. I can still see, and I like read your essay on imposter syndrome, and I loved it.
No, that's great.
I think there's some cases where like my reaction was similar to yours, where I would like opt out of doing stuff. Like a key example of here is like, for example, like interviews. So like I do a lot of interviews, and like about like often with like news media, because they want like to get the facts right for their articles, which is great.
Sure.
Or like on the radio, and like I do a lot of them, but like I also like turn down a lot of them. Now some of them I turn down because like I just can't possibly do them all, but some of them I turn down because, one, I either feel like I'm not the expert that they should be speaking to about that, which is sometimes right, but sometimes I think it's not right, and I like could very easily answer their questions. So I either reject it because I feel like I'm not expert enough, or also because I just know that to them it seems like I'm giving them 10 minutes of my time to give them the answer, but because I'm so paranoid about getting the stuff right, I probably check it then 5 times, and then I come back to it later to check it, and then I probably have a sleepless night in case I gave them the wrong number and they put it on the radio.
Yeah.
So like sometimes I just say no because I'm like, I actually want to sleep tonight.
Yeah, that sounds terrible. And I know the feeling of the sleepless night when you're worried you've made a mistake or might make a mistake in some like fact you've been asked about, and it sucks. It really sucks. So yeah, I'm really sorry to hear. You said that you feel like you've kind of made some progress on it. Is there a single thing that you feel like has helped most?
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely got a lot better. Like I've actually done therapy, and it was like one of the big parts of therapy. And like I think there's a couple of things we worked through which I found helpful. One is, and I actually think it's the opposite, like it's to some extent the opposite from you, because I think it was one of the things you said, like was really a hindrance for you, and it's like the catastrophizing thing.
Right. Yeah. Imagining the worst thing that could possibly happen.
Yeah. Where actually, I think I find it quite useful sometimes to do that and to work through, okay, like I get the number wrong. Like I say, like I go on the radio and I say the wrong number. Like, what's the worst thing that could happen? Like, oh, like someone points out that I got the number wrong. I have to apologize to the BBC because I got the number wrong. They're understanding because people get numbers wrong. Like even the best people get the numbers wrong.
Yeah, right.
And like I can't do that all the time, and I probably have a limited number of lives on that. But like if I do that once, it's fine and it's not the end of the world. And I think they're like another big thing has just been like building an evidence base for the fact that like I've done all this stuff. It hasn't gone wrong. Like it's going fine. Like I am careful with the numbers. I'm not gonna just like pluck one out of thin air. Like I know that I'm careful, and I like try to base everything on the research, and I have evidence of like doing these perfectly fine. So like often I should just draw on that and trust myself that this time I'm also gonna do fine.
Totally. Yeah. That exercise of like being able to recall all the times that you did the things and they went fine seems like huge. Okay, well, I'm glad. It sounds like that isn't causing you as much anxiety, which feels really hopeful to me. I mean, you've written a book, you've given a TED Talk, and so it sounds like you've made enough progress to be able to still do really ambitious things, not have your anxiety be horribly painful. And I think that's just great, given that it sounds like we've struggled with some of the same feelings.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, no problem.
Moral philosopher Will MacAskill on being proactive about mental health and preventing burnout.
One thing that is always a little bit hard to make sense of when I'm updating your little bio at the top of the episode every time we do an interview is just you seem to have so much stuff going on at any point in time. There's so many competing priorities, like pulling you every which way. So I guess at the moment you've got the whole book thing coming up, and you've been working on the book.
Yeah,
you're still at the University of Oxford, right? You're still a philosophy professor, as I understand it. You're helping to run the Forethought Foundation, which you also helped to set up. And I know, whenever 80,000 Hours has a particularly thorny problem that we can't figure out between the 20 of us, I think you're one of the people we turn to for advice, and I think we're in good company there. Yeah, when I solicited questions for this episode, quite a lot of people responded with this similar sort of disbelief at the lifestyle you lead or the amount of work responsibilities that you have. But yeah, people were curious, like, how are you doing on a personal level? How do you cope with it all?
So it's a good question. I very often feel too thinly spread, and that is a cause of stress. It also just is the case. So, we've talked a lot on previous podcasts about, it's a marathon, not a sprint, the importance of looking after yourself and making sure that you're working in a way that's sustainable over the long term. I will acknowledge the last 4 months or so, maybe 6 months, have not been sustainable in terms of how hard I've been working.
Right.
Where in particular, I really did a big sprint to finish the book, over the course of 2021. I just really got quite obsessed by it. I was working extremely hard. I mean, I think the fact that I had been so attentive to the idea of it's a marathon, not a sprint for many years before that, did allow me to pull out the extra gear for these last few months. I also will return to that again. I'm taking some time off literally next week.
Okay.
Obviously the book launch will be intense, but no, I'm going to move back to a more sustainable state. But I think the fact that, I had invested in myself, I just now am far happier than I was, say, 13 years ago. And progressively so. I estimate I'm 5 to 10 times happier than I was.
I guess, so you're public about having had depression for quite an extended time, I guess, as a teenager, as an undergraduate as well, and having spent a lot of time working on that. How have you ended up 5 or 10 times happier? It sounds like a large multiple.
So, I mean, one part of it is being, still positive, but somewhat close to zero, back then. But also now I would say that I'm now, among the, even if I think of my peer group, say friends from university and so on, I probably put myself in the happiest 10% or something. So that's really pretty good.
That's so good.
I feel I feel happy about it. And that's been from just a wide variety of things, just over a very long time period. There's the classics, like learning to sleep well and meditate and get the right medication and exercise. There's also just been an awful lot of just understanding your own mind and having good responses. So for me, the thing that often happens is I start to beat myself up for not being productive enough or not being smart enough or just kind of otherwise failing or something. And having a triggered action plan where when that starts happening, I'm like, okay, suddenly like the top priority on my to-do list again is like looking after my mental health. And often that just means like taking some time off, working out, meditating, and then and like perhaps also just journaling as well to recognize that I'm like being a little bit crazy and like reframing
overriding
things.
the natural instincts.
Yeah. So I don't know, in the case of perhaps I'll be feeling like on a day I'm just like, oh, I'm being so slow at this, like other people would be so much more productive, or like feeling inadequate. Then I can be like, look, okay, well, sure, maybe today's not going so well, but like how was the last like 6 months or something? Like think about like what have you achieved then? And it's like, okay, that does seem better. And so I've just gotten better at like these kind of mental habits. And that's just been this very long process, but it's really paid off, I think.
Yeah. Was it a matter of finding out that was something that's important to do? Or I mean, I think a lot of people who tend to beat themselves up about work or just about their performance in life in general, they might know in principle that those are exactly the moments when they need to ease off on themselves and like focus on their well-being and their mental health. But of course, that's the last thing you want to do if you feel like you're not being productive. Like the natural instinct is, no, now I need to double down, I need to pull an all-nighter to finish this project. And that instinct can be so strong that it can kind of override like what you've read in any mental health books.
Yeah, so I think this was a huge realization for me, and I think I have to thank a very excellent therapist who I've subsequently put a bunch of EAs onto. I think she was really confused by why she just gets so many referrals from me. But yeah, because when I came into there, and when was that, like 2012, 2013 maybe no, probably even earlier, 2011, I definitely had this mindset that the self-flagellation, the negative brain propaganda was very important. And I remember she said, like, well, you seem very stressed. I was like, of course I'm stressed. I'm a utilitarian.
We have to suffer.
Exactly.
That's the core part of the philosophy.
Exactly. And the thought was like, oh, no, maybe I'd like lose. You know, it felt like, okay, well, it's, sacrifice of my own well-being, but like it's in order to achieve things. And she just kind of called bullshit on that. And I think she was just totally correct, which is like, no, you're just beating yourself up.
Yeah.
And you would do that whether or not you were like trying to do
Did you
good
only
in the world.
just start doing this when you discovered moral philosophy?
Exactly. No, I was doing it when I was a teenager and wanted to be a poet. I mean, so that was like the fundamental insight was like, oh no, actually maybe this is bad for me doing good in the world. And that lesson, like I started that lesson, and it took a very long time because it's like you've built up by that point this like mental habit.
Such a strong urge.
Yeah, this whole set of mental propaganda to back that thought of like, no, this is important, and like the things you really care about, you will drop if you don't
express any kindness to yourself.
Exactly, yeah. And so it was helpful having some role models as well. I think Holden's really good in this regard. So he's always someone I've always looked up to and respected an enormous amount, and just is hugely productive. And he would be like, yeah, I never feel guilt. I never beat myself up. How do I decide how many hours I do? Well, I look at what's my average number of hours that I've worked the last few months, and I work that number. Or like I try and maybe try and be higher than that number.
Yeah.
And I was like, you can do this? Like, that's possible.
And when does the suffering come in? It's like, when do you schedule it? Yeah.
Exactly. And I think it is just important. And it means like having those mental habits in place from this long time period of investment, does mean that like if there are like particular moments, opportunities where it's like, oh wow, I can have real impact here. Well, it means you do have this extra kind of gas canister to use.
Yeah, we should really do an episode on self-compassion at some point soon. Because it just seems like, I mean, I feel like I know a lot of people because of like the seriousness of the problems that we're dealing with or trying to solve, who are like extremely harsh on themselves all the time, and exactly have this mentality that if I wasn't harsh on myself, if I wasn't beating myself up all the time about ensuring that I get my work done, then I wouldn't get anything done. And I think it's I mean, there's like a lot of research into this now, which shows that is mistaken. It's like, very counterproductive, which is unsurprising in a sense. Like if you had someone who was kind of managing, someone in an organization through a difficult project, a difficult time, they're taking on a big challenge professionally, you would never have them kind of follow this person around and denigrate their efforts all the time, being like, you're not working hard enough. You need to go, go harder. And like this, this just shows your stupidity, the work that you've done today. Obviously, you'd get a lot more done if you had someone who was supportive, like coaching you through the challenges. Like sometimes maybe like geeing you on a little bit and saying, no, you can do better. But like, that's not, being brutal to someone isn't like terrible management. And yet that is like the thing that people are saying to themselves is like what they desperately need, the voice in their head all the time. Yeah,
it's incredible how much of a asymmetry people can have. And certainly I had and still have with respect to other people versus myself. I remember I did a meditation that really had quite a big impact on me, which was just a gratitude meditation. And I was very used to being grateful for other people and like feel that very strongly. The meditation got me to be grateful for myself, asked me to do that. I was like, I've never thought of that before, of doing that. And I was like, yeah, man, I really am thankful for the things like earlier Will did. And it was pretty striking that something that is so like an attitude I would so easily have towards other people, I hadn't even thought to have towards myself. And that's just, absolutely the same as well with, being critical and forgiving. Very different attitudes by disposition to other people and myself.
I used to do a bunch of this. I think I was never quite at the level that you were back in 2011, but I used to like beat myself up like pretty regularly about like I'm too lazy, I'm like messing this and that up. And I think antidepressants made a huge difference for me, and just like kind of breaking that habit of being self, like waking up in the morning and spending half an hour in bed, just like thinking about how I'm like failing to achieve various goals. And letting go of that did not damage my productivity at all. I'm not getting as much done. I'm like more energetic and like more enthusiastic to do things because it doesn't bring with it this like anxiety and self-denigration.
That's great to hear. And you do just seem a lot happier and more zen than back in the day.
It is just such a revelation to realize that it was completely unnecessary all along.
Grantmaker Ajeya Cotra on the psychological toll of tackling big, open-ended research questions.
All right. So working on big open-ended reports like this can be a bit of a mess, and I think like difficult for people intellectually and I guess also psychologically. What are the biggest challenges with this work? How do you think that you almost got tripped up or that other people tend to get tripped up?
I mean, one thing that's really tough is like academic fields that have been around for a while have a sort of intuition or aesthetic that they pass on to like new members about what's like a unit of publishable work. Like it's sometimes called like a publon, right? Like what kind of result is big enough and what kind of argument is compelling enough and complete enough that you can like package it into a paper and publish it. And I think with the work that we're trying to do, partly because it's new and partly because of the kind of nature of the work itself, it's much less clear what a publishable unit is or like when you're done. And you like almost always find yourself in a situation where like there's a lot more research you could do than you sort of assumed naively going in. And it's not always like a bad thing. It's not always like you're being inefficient or you're going down rabbit holes if you choose to do that research and just end up doing a much bigger project than you thought you were going to do. I think this was the case with all of the like timelines work that we did at Open Phil, like my report and then other reports. It was always the case that we came in, I thought I would do kind of like a more simple evaluation of arguments made by our technical advisors, but then complications came up. And then it just became a much longer project. And I don't regret most of that. So it's not as simple as saying like, just really force yourself to guess at the outset how much time you want to spend on it and just spend that time. But at the same time, there definitely are rabbit holes and there definitely are like things you can do that eat up a bunch of time without giving you much epistemic value. So like standards for that seem like a big, difficult issue with this work.
Okay, so this question of what's the publishable unit and what rabbit holes should you go down? Are there any other ways things can go wrong that stand out or mistakes that you potentially made at some points?
Yeah, I mean, looking back, I think I did a lot of what I sort of think of as like defensive writing, where basically there were a bunch of things I knew about the subject that were like, definitely true. And I could explain them nicely and like they lean on math and stuff. But those things were like only peripherally relevant to the central point I wanted to make. And then there were a bunch of other things that were like hard and messy and mostly intuitions I had. And like, I didn't know how to formalize them, but they were doing most of the real work. One big example is that of the 4 things we talked about, the most important one by far is the 2020 computation requirements. Like, how much computation would it take to train transformative model if we had to do it today? But it was also the most nebulous and least defensible. So like, I found myself wanting to spend more time on hardware forecasting, where I could say stuff that didn't sound stupid. And so like, as I sat down to write this big report after I had like a sort of internal draft. I had an internal draft all the way back in like November of 2019. And then I sat down to write the like publishable draft. And I was like, okay, I'll clean up this internal draft. But I just like found myself being pulled to writing things, like knowing that like fancy ML people would read this. I found myself being pulled to just like demonstrating that I knew stuff. And so I would just be like, I'd write, 10 pages on machine learning theory that were like, perfectly reasonable intros to machine learning theory. But actually this horizon length question was the real crux. And it was like messy and like not found in any textbook. And so I had to like do a lot to curb my instinct to defensive writing and my instinct to like put stuff in there just because I wanted to like dilute the like crazy speculative stuff with a lot of facts and like show people that I knew what I was talking about.
Yeah, that's understandable. How did the work affect you kind of personally from a happiness or job satisfaction or mental health point of view? Because I think sometimes people throw themselves against like problems like this, and I think it causes them to feel very anxious because they don't know whether they're doing a good job or a bad job, or they don't feel they're making progress, or they feel depressed because they worry that they haven't figured it out yet and they feel bad about that.
Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of those emotions. Like, I think the most fun part of the project was like the beginning parts where my audience was mostly myself and Holden. And I was like reading these arguments that our technical advisors made and basically just like finding issues with them and like explaining what I learned. And that's just a very fun way to be. You're sort of like, you have something you can bite onto and react to, and then you're like pulling stuff out of it and like restating it and finding issues with it. It's much more rewarding for me than like you're looking at a blank page and you're no longer writing something in response to somebody else. You have to just like lay it all out for somebody who has no idea what you're talking about. And so I was starting writing this final draft, the draft that eventually became the thing posted on Less Wrong in January of 2020. And I gave myself a deadline of March 9th to write it all. And in fact, I spent most of January and half of February really stressed out about how I would even frame the model. And a lot of the stuff we were talking about like there are these 4 parts. And then the first part is like, if we had to do it today, how much computation would it take to train? All of that came out of this angsty phase where before I was just like, how much computation does it take to train TAI? And like, when will we get that? But that had this important conceptual flaw that I ended up spending a lot of time on, which is like, no, that number is different in different years because of algorithmic progress. And so like, I was trying to force myself to just write down what I thought I knew. But I had like a long period of being like, this is bad. Like, people will look at this, and if they're kind of exacting, rigorous people, they will be like, this doesn't make sense. There's no such thing as the amount of computation to train a transformative model. And I was very hung up on that kind of stuff. And I think sometimes it's great to be hung up on that kind of stuff. And in particular, I think my report is stronger because I was hung up on that particular thing. But sometimes it's just like, you're like killing yourself over something. You should just say, this is kind of a vague, fuzzy notion, but you know what I mean. And it's just like so hard to figure out when to do one versus the other.
Yeah, I think knowing this problem of often the most important things can't be rigorously justified, and you kind of just have to state your honest opinion, like all things considered, given everything you know about the world and your general intuitions, like that's the best you can do. And like trying to do something else is just like a kind of fake science thing that where you're going through the motions of defending yourself against critics.
Yeah, like physics envy.
Yeah, right. I think
I had a lot of physics envy.
Yeah, I'm just like more indignant about that now. I'm just like, look, I think this, you don't necessarily have to agree with me, but I'm just going to like give you my number, and I'm not going to feel bad about it at all. And I won't feel bad if you don't agree, because this unfortunately is the state of the art process that we have for estimating this one, is just to like say what we think. I mean, so sometimes you can do better, but sometimes you really are pretty stuck.
Yeah. And I think just learning the difference is really hard, because like I do think this report, I believe, has made some progress toward justifying things that were previously just like intuitions we stated. But then there were many things where I hoped to do that I had to give up on. I think also doing a report that is trying to get to a number on like an important decision relevant question is like a ton of pressure, because like you can be like really good at laying out the arguments and like finding all the considerations and stuff, but like your brain might not be weighing them right. and like how you weigh them, like the alchemy going on in your head when you assign weights to like lifetime versus evolution versus things in between, make a huge difference to the final number. And, you know, if you feel like your job is to get the right number, that can be like really, really scary and stressful. So like I've tried to reframe it as like my job is to lay out the arguments and make a model that makes sense. You know, how the inputs get turned into outputs makes sense and is clear to people. And so like the next person who wants to come up with their views on timelines doesn't have to do all the work I did, but they still need to like put in their numbers. Like my job is not to get the ultimate right numbers. I think reframing that was really important for my mental health.
Yeah, because that's something you actually have like a decent shot at having control over whether you succeed at that. Whereas being able to produce the right number is like to a much greater degree out of your hands.
Researcher and grantmaker Christian Ruhl on how having a stutter affects him personally and professionally.
You have very generously offered to talk about the experience of having a stutter. So I'm curious to just basically dive right into that if you're up for it. Starting, I guess, with what is the experience of stuttering like from the inside? What does it feel like to not be able to say what you want to say sometimes?
So what does this feel like? It's kind of like your thoughts are trapped inside of your body, right? So like, let's back up a little bit. Like stuttering, what is it? It's like this neurological disorder. We don't really understand it, but it's now understood to probably have some sort of pretty strong genetic component. Affects about 1% of the population. Most people grow out of it. And like from the outside, it often looks like people are sort of repeating, they're going they're blocking, sort of they're stopping in a specific thing, or they're prolonging their words or prolonging, right? So I think from the outside, it sometimes looks like somebody is at a loss for words.
Right.
But in fact, what's happening is like, I have no trouble forming sentences, either in sort of like mental language, like concepts, images, whatever, or in English in my head. The issue is there's some sort of disconnect between what I want to say and sort of what my body is doing. Sort of, it's not working right.
Right. Do you literally have the English word in your head, or is it more that you have the general ideas in your head and then it's somewhere between ideas and words? Or is it more like you could literally hear the sentence in your head and it's about speech?
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? I feel like we could go on a long tangent about this portion, about like, so like language of thoughts. I think like mentalese is a word that people sometimes use, right? So like it's both, right? So I'm able to kind of form ideas and concepts in like mentalese in my head, and I'm able to kind of consciously like say them quote unquote out loud in my head, right? Fluently.
Right. Okay.
The issue is really translating that into vibrations of the air.
Got it. Okay, so that's what it feels like kind of intellectually. Mm-hmm. How has your stutter had much of an impact on you emotionally?
Yeah, I think 100%, right? I think it can be like really emotionally draining. I think I'm personally like fundamentally like an outgoing person, and kind of like totally blocks that impulse. Yeah, so maybe we can think about like your average day, right? So, and think about like the moments every day that you rely on speaking fluently. So like maybe it's like the morning, it's like 7:30, you want to have a coffee, you go to your coffee shop, and you're like, okay, I'm going to order a coffee. What kind of coffee should we order?
I would like a soy latte with vanilla and peppermint.
Okay, that's great. Or like soy latte with vanilla and peppermint, or as I might say, I'm going to try to say it, right? And that's like what the person behind the counter might hear, and kind of like totally block, stand there with an open mouth, looking helpless, and like, what does the other person see? Like, you think in your head, oh, what are they thinking? Do they think, is that guy having a stroke? Should I call an ambulance? Is he on drugs? Right. So like, maybe in the end you manage to get out the word, or you like point towards the board and just like, that was bad. But like you get the point across, like, I want this specific thing. And, then they ask, oh, what's the like name for the order? And like a frustrating thing that a lot of people who stutter have is that they block on their own name.
Oh my gosh.
So like, do I make up a fake name that's easier to say? Like, that's crazy. Or do I try to say my own name and can't, and then the response is like, oh, like, did you forget your name? Haha, right? This is like the morning.
That sounds so frustrating.
But let's imagine like you have your coffee in hand, walking out, and your hands are full. Suddenly you like maybe remember something you wanted to write down for a report you're working on about nuclear war. Maybe you like try to use the like voice assistant on your phone, and like it's not designed to work for you. Right, but like that's kind of what it feels, right? So like try to like paint a picture there. Small moments, like, compared to like the things that happen to many people, it's like not a big deal, but like all these small moments throughout your life that like where fluency would be really helpful.
Totally. Yeah. To what extent do you get desensitized to the feeling of like, ugh, that was frustrating. I couldn't get the word out again. Or does that get limited at some point? And I don't know, maybe you feel a bit less frustrated, but it is just still freaking frustrating to not get the words out.
It remains really frustrating.
Oh,
yeah. And it's
God.
like, so getting desensitized to it is hard. That's kind of like, as I understand it, like the latest approach to speech therapy is kind of about this, right? Just like being okay with stuttering openly. But that's easier said than done, or in my case, both hard to say and hard to do.
Yep. Yeah. Imagining it for myself, it is really, really hard to imagine. Yeah, just really hard to imagine just accepting this isn't going to get easier. It's going to keep happening. Yeah, I guess even more personal, do you feel like it had an impact on you growing up? I don't know. I think maybe I'd imagine feeling especially awkward as a kid when I didn't understand the thing quite as well, and maybe other kids didn't understand the thing quite as well.
Yeah. So like, I was fortunate enough to like grow up in a really like loving home with great parents and so on. So that's wonderful. But like you can imagine still like in school, right? The kid who can't say his own name or like who can't get a word out when called on in class is going to have a hard time. So I tried for a while doing speech therapy, and for some people that works. For me, it didn't. At one point, I don't remember if it was like at Cambridge or Oxford, but I'm a big fan of like self-experimentation. So I participated in this like experimental trial where they were like investigating transcranial direct current stimulation and trying to figure out if like zapping your brain a little can help. It didn't, but it was still interesting.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I guess I am curious to what extent you think it's. I'm both curious if you think the actual stutter has gotten better, and then I'm also curious if your experience of it has gotten better. I'm like just super, super impressed that you're like, I'm going to go on a podcast. And I have to believe that, I don't know, it took a bunch of emotional work at least to get to the point where you were like, yep, I want to do that.
Thank you. Yeah. And I hope we didn't sort of give 30 minutes of content in 90 minutes of time. But so the stutter itself has not gotten better for me personally. Again, as I mentioned, I think a lot of kids grow out of it. I just didn't.
Yeah.
My emotional response to it, I think, has gotten better in the sense of like, at some point, you just have to like try being comfortable with being uncomfortable, and like, okay, I managed this like philanthropic fund. It would be good for my people to know about it because I think there's a lot of like good in the world, and more people know about it. Maybe they'll give money to it. So like, I should go on a podcast so people can hear about it. Ugh, I have to go on a podcast. So like, I'm trying to do that more. And like in terms of stuttering less, there's this concept of like stuttering freely, of just like communication is a two-way street, right? And like, it's not just on the listener to speak fluently. It's also on not just on the speaker to speak fluently, but also on the listener to like be patient. And I think we all have speech patterns of like ums and ahs.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like that a lot. Okay. And then, yeah, I mean, you're kind of touching on it already, but to what extent has having a stutter affected your career?
Yeah, like maybe I would do more podcasts. This is fun. But yeah, so like one part might be like job interviews, right? Like those can be really challenging. Actually, to go back, like other things that are in a similar boat are like talking to police or talking to like immigration services.
Oh, that sounds like a nightmare.
It's the absolute worst, right? Because they think like you're hiding something and they get suspicious. God. And I already don't like them. And,
right. No, I'm terrified of talking to customs people.
Yeah. But anyway, back to like job interviews. Yeah. So those can be really frustrating and challenging. And I think like, I have to give like a bit of a shout out to like the Founders Pledge hiring process here, where I think like a lot of organizations working on these kinds of issues really emphasize like a work task. It was like, do like expected value calculations on this difficult problem. So like write a short essay on this like philosophical issue. So it's like entirely about skills was like the meat of the hiring process. And I think that for somebody who has like a speech or hearing disability, sort of super helpful, right? And like once you do that, I feel like I find interviews being like, oh, by the way, I stutter, I have this thing, don't think it keeps me from doing good work. Yeah. I think back to how it affected your career, if I had to think about it, like maybe it's pushed me more into a career focused on writing as like an outlet for like the language part of my brain.
Yeah, that makes sense. Has it stopped you from applying to things? I don't know, just the fear of interviews or something.
In the past, it has, yeah. Now I'm definitely trying to like catch myself and be like, nope, I should just apply, or like I should just be in this like panel.
Wow.
So like recently, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, Hayden Belfield and I had written this article, and they gave us a prize. They were like, good job on the article, and part of it was like speaking at the like annual meeting they have, the conversations before midnight, and I was like, that's terrifying. But then I caught myself and I was like, hey, I should just do it. I did, and I stuttered, and it was like uncomfortable, but it was fine.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, that sounds great. I guess my experience of repeatedly forcing myself to do things that sound really terrifying and costly is like, it is like in some cases it like gets easier over time. It's still really exhausting being like regularly, I am going to stifle my own fear about doing this, do this terrifying thing like speak at a conference, and then have all the panic afterward about whether I did a good job. And like even if it does get easier, it gets easier so slowly over time that it still means that like the first 30 times of speaking at a conference are like kind of torturous. I'm impressed that you have the like stamina. I feel like there are some things I've just given up on. Like I have like a default email that's like, I don't speak at conferences because it makes me too anxious. So I think it's really cool and inspiring that you, I don't know, push yourself. Do you feel like it's important to set limits? Like sometimes you give yourself an out to be like, I don't have to do that really hard thing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm totally with you there. Don't have to be too hard on ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah. And then how do you decide, I guess?
I mean, like one thing that's helpful with my job is like, in terms of motivation, it helps that I feel like I'm genuinely doing good in the world. So like, let's say I'm like interviewing an expert about like pandemic preparedness. It's like much easier to kind of get over myself because I know that like, hey, maybe philanthropists can like help make grants to sort of mitigate these risks
right.
if I write a good report or whatever. So that's like one way of sort of deciding.
Mercy for Animals CEO Leah Garcés on insisting on self-care when doing difficult work.
A lot of people who fight against factory farming like struggle with mental health challenges, and I think it's not just because they're working a lot. It's also because the work is so confronting, constantly having to like think about the horrible suffering that you're working to prevent. Yeah, have you ever become kind of despondent or anxious because of this? And I guess how did you approach that? And maybe how do you recommend that other people in the organization approach it?
Yeah, I definitely have become despondent and depressed, and the severity of the injustice that we're trying to work on. And I really hit a wall in the last summer was the first trip I took out during the pandemic. And I went to visit a factory farm of one of the transformation farmers. And, I'd been holed up in my office for 9 months. And then the next thing I know, I'm inside of a factory farm filming some of the worst atrocities in the world in my mind. These horrible, chickens with sores, lame chickens, just horrific, overcrowding, ammonia, unable to breathe, myself, let alone the chickens. And it really hit me hard. And to realize that this continued. I think during the pandemic, I thought maybe, I'd been able to ignore it more. And I had, I hit a real period of depression. And I think that I did a lot to change my life at that point. So I think there are a number of things. You have to prioritize self-care. And this means things like exercise regularly, 8 hours of sleep, eat healthy. I don't drink at all right now, which is maybe a surprise to people, but I stopped drinking at that point, alcohol. You have to do what makes you show up your best self, because the work we do is witnessing trauma every single day. We are bearing witness to trauma that is a normalized atrocity in our society. So it's heavy. It is heavy. And we're already a movement of empaths in many cases. So people who already feel more than others and absorb more than others because we're already, responding to this atrocity when others aren't. So we are especially sensitive to it. And so, and you add into that deaths during the pandemic and Me Too and sort of kind of the racial uprising issues. It's been a difficult year. It's a lot. And so I think you have to prioritize self-care. And I model that for everyone. I insist on vacation. I follow up my staff and say, okay, I can see you haven't taken any vacation. You need to take a break. I'm the type of person who thinks that advocates need more vacation, not less, because we need to last. We have to last the whole time that factory farming exists. And to do that, you need to pace yourself. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And self-care is really critical.
Yeah. Do you ever have an approach either as an individual, as an organization, for what you do when a staff member, they're starting to show signs that maybe they're becoming depressed, maybe they're having, serious anxiety at the moment. And it can be very hard, I think, sometimes for a workplace to know what to do at that point. Do you encourage people to take sick time off or?
Yeah, we have a lot of resources that we offer staff. But we also have maintenance. So we, for example, have courses that we regularly offer to staff on compassion fatigue. And then within that workshop, which we ask people to attend, there's resources, books, and different approaches that we suggest people take. We also offer people $700 per team member for self-care, and that can be for therapy, it can be for a gym. It's not a whole lot, but it's something in which we're kind of offering to staff. And we have mental health leave, and we also have our regular leave. We have quite a number of vacation days, I think more than most in the United States, 25 days on top of and that in Brazil, it's even more. In Mexico, it's around that too.
Well, yeah, thanks to you and all of your colleagues for the very difficult work that you do, work that I think would certainly challenge my mental health. But it seems like it's bearing fruit, and hopefully things are going to be better in a couple of decades. We might even see the back of this thing.
I hope so. My goal is to put us out of business and retire on the beach somewhere, put my feet up.
80,000 Hours former CEO Howie on balancing a job and mental illness.
So I think that there is this difficult balance of wanting to keep the things that are giving you structure and meaning and purpose in your life, and then also wanting to make sure you're not putting yourself in a situation that's self-destructive, or just where you're setting yourself goals that you just can't possibly meet. And so that just means different things for different people. And I think there is one meme out there that I really strongly disagree with. That's look, you're mental health is the most important thing in the entire world. Do whatever it takes to get that fixed. If you're feeling bad, take a break, focus on yourself. That's your priority until you get healthy. There are things close to that I agree with, but some of us aren't going to have a moment where it's all right, you're healthy now. you are officially a normal, and like you get like a certificate. For some people, it's just gonna be like a lifelong struggle. And so I, at least, don't want to put off living my life and doing the parts of my life that matter to me until this is like fixed. And that's like really important to me because like years where I'm like trying to fix this thing are also like years of my life. I think like, so it is like important to like consider that. And some people are the type of people who can be super functional and be really depressed or really anxious at the same time. And like, I think for some of them, the right choice is to just keep doing what you're doing. Also, one of the most valuable things you can possibly do is to get your mental health treatment better. And we'll talk about that later. And like, I just think it's like so valuable to see if there's a way that you can do that. But like, also just like keeping your life the same at the same time is like the right decision for some people. And for some people, it's like, this is putting me at risk of failing in a way that is going to like make me self-undermine. And like, I just need a break, or just like need the like space and like the headspace to like think things through and actually work on myself instead of like every day being focused on like the next deadline. I think it just like varies a lot by person. Questions that I like have tried to ask myself and sometimes like suggested to other people they ask themselves is like, think about the sort of like things that they get out of their job that are important to them, that are like important to their well-being, that are important to like making sure that they like stay to the extent as possible out of spirally horribly depressed zone, and ask what is like the minimal viable project that will get you what you need. And when you're like depressed and like facing a rough patch, I think lowering your expectations of yourself and lowering others' expectations of you is basically something that you like owe the world. You like do need to actually like, it's really hard to like look the thing in the face and admit that it's happening, but it just may be the case you can't do what you used to be able to do. So like, I think it's just like actively very good to lower expectations, lower your responsibilities. That might mean like reducing your hours, it might mean quitting a job. And so thinking about like, what are like the most responsibilities I can possibly drop while still making sure that I have a sense of like meaning and structure, I think it's like one framing that I find useful.
Therapist Hannah Boettcher on how self-compassion isn't self-indulgence.
Yeah, I'd actually love to talk more about self-compassion. Yeah, I have to admit, I, for a long time, I just really bounced off the idea of self-compassion and off of compassion-focused therapy, which came up a number of times. And I kept being like, no, I don't want to do that. My reaction to the idea of being more compassionate toward myself was like, oh, that sounds like lowering my standards, or that sounds like letting myself off the hook, or that sounds like, I don't know, some kind of like over-the-top self-care that I don't identify with. I mean, a little bit of like, that sounds weak. I want to be strong.
Yeah, that sounds like things I've heard inside my head and from clients before.
Okay. So it's not just me. Yeah, to some extent, I've made some progress on this. I don't have those associations quite as strongly. But yeah, for listeners who do still have some of that, can you help us have a different framing?
Absolutely. The thing we're aiming for is not anything goes or my standards don't matter. The thing we're aiming for is no matter where I've set the standard, how can I show up for treating myself well and kindly and effectively along the way? And let's also be clear that self-compassion is actually useful, right? So, well, first of all, it's justified. We've said this already. We are the sorts of creatures that suffer, and we suffer for reasons out of our control that we didn't choose. In my view, that justifies compassion. But even separately from that, self-compassion works better than self-loathing and self-berating. So when you're in a constant state of self-criticism, this is kicking up additional suffering that you then have to metabolize.
Right.
Whereas when you can relate as a matter of self-compassion, this actually enhances performance more than self-criticism does. And it makes for a better subjective experience.
Right, better experience. Yeah, okay. That sounds totally right. Cool. Well, yeah, then I guess we've got to go all in on self-compassion.
Yeah.
And something more like, you are doing something super important, super brave, super valuable. Thank you for doing it.
Yes. And you are materially creating a world where a lot of people are pushing toward impact. And that is worth being a part
wonderful.
of.
Journalist Kelsey Piper on how to communicate about mental health in ways that resonate.
So you've written lots of things on the unit of caring, your blog over the years. I noticed one thing that is kind of related to EA, though it's not directly about EA, is kind of dealing with mental health issues or like dealing with challenges in your life. And I think probably hundreds of people, it seems, have written into you with like questions about like, I'm like struggling with this or that problem in my life. Like, how do you think I should deal with it? And you answer like, I think with a lot of wisdom and like people really respect your opinions on this for that reason. Are there any kind of like general lessons you think you can take away or share from just people dealing with like very difficult circumstances in their life for so long?
Yeah, I think one thing I get out of that is seeing all of the ways that people can sort of be hurting and all of the ways that the narratives and advice available to them can fail to sort of resonate. And that's just made me more aware of like how many ways you need to communicate something to successfully get it across. But things that seem to often be important to communicate are that, results-oriented thinking, that what matters is to figuring out how to get outcomes you want and not to beat yourself up over whether you're having the right thoughts or the right feelings or whether you care for the right reasons or whether your justifications are valid. Trusting yourself more, feeling like in a situation where you can't believe your own thinking and your own reasoning processes and your own senses. Those are just very destructive situations for people, and it's important to prioritize feeling like your opinions matter and feeling like you have the ability to reason about reality. And then just that everybody's going through a lot. Like, I find work hard sometimes because there are days when I actually just can't get out of bed and find it very hard to do anything at all. And that's probably a little bit unusual, but the impression I've gotten through talking to enough people is that almost everybody has stuff that amount of difficult that they're dealing with. And if you're imagining I'm the one person who deals with stuff like that, then of course you're going to kind of despair of having a successful, healthy, fulfilling life. But if you know that everybody else is also dealing with stuff, then it can be easier to be like, okay, but some of them do have lives that I could like aspire to and that I could have. And I think it's good for people to be aware that, there's lots of really great lives out there that don't involve fixing everything, but just figuring out how to work around what you've got.
If you liked that episode, I highly recommend you check out the full episodes from Randy Nesse, Tim LeBon, and Hannah Boettcher. We have links to all of those in the blog post for this episode. And last year, my colleague Cody Fennick put together a blog post called Mental Health in Your Career, Our Top Resources. It's really worth checking out. It includes some of these episodes, as well as articles we've written over the years about how to pursue impactful careers without sacrificing your well-being. All right, thanks to the production team for putting that compilation together. We'll be back with a fully new interview very soon.